History project to preserve the stories of Cajun World War II veterans from South Louisiana. From this work, he produced a 3-volume book series plus an extensive oral history archive at the Center for Louisiana Studies at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He earned his doctorate in history from the University of Houston and a degree in journalism from Louisiana State University. Please welcome Dr. Jason Theriot.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you all for coming in. Thanks to our audio video text guy for getting us set up in the last minute. My name is Jason Theriot. I'm from a town called New Iberia, Louisiana. Okay. All right, any other Theriots here?
Yay!
There's one over there. My wife. If you didn't know it was her, she's wearing a Theriot t-shirt. This is a project that I got started on about 20 years ago. And I haven't talked about this to people in some time, although I recognize some faces here. So I'm a little rusty on it, but I've picked it back up with thanks to Miss Brenda Como-Trahan for inviting me here a couple of months ago. She actually invited me 5 years ago to go to Maine, and I do remember the phone call, and I said, Miss Brenda, I can't make it, but call me back next time. And you certainly did, so I thank you for doing that. And like I said, it's been a while since I picked up on this, so I took down a few notes here, and it's allowed me to kind of rekindle this topic that's been such a big part of my life and a lot of people in my family and the surrounding community about the Cajuns of World War II. So I'll read you a little introduction and we'll get rolling with some slides here. The presentation will be about 45 minutes. We'll save a couple of minutes at the end for some questioning. And then after that, after this lady comes on, I'll be sitting over here and visiting if anyone wants to come and talk. Okay, so this is the story about the French-speaking Cajun GIs of World War II, whose journeys took them from the banks of the bayous and surrounding communities to various combat zones in French North Africa and in parts of France, Normandy, and Brittany. Their overseas experience was particularly unique. Why? Because the vast majority of these Cajuns grew up speaking French, right? These were the same Cajuns who had a stigma attached to them and to their language for most of their lives. However, for some, the wartime experience justified their cultural differences in these French-speaking territories. Interesting, huh? Many served as translators and as interpreters, and some even served as special forces operatives operating behind enemy lines with the French resistance forces. Their French language became invaluable. That's what's important to remember here. With this talent, they made significant contributions to the Allied war efforts. These contributions have gone largely unrecognized in the larger context of World War II history, in my opinion. But more importantly for our people, right, the Cajun people, these Cajun veterans emerged from the war with a newfound appreciation for their unique heritage. Yes, they embraced the Americanization process. Yes, they did not teach their kids how to speak French in a French language home like their generations had done before. Yes, they embraced this Americanization, but they also were proud of their Cajun heritage. Many returned from the war embracing their culture and their unique Cajunness. And these attitudes spilled over into the cultural revival that swept through Acadiana in the 1960s and 70s. So this is going to be the story of the Cajuns of World War II. As I mentioned, this project began many years ago for me, 20 years ago. My grandfather, Hewitt Theriot from New Iberia, some of you may have known back in the day, I approached him to write a book about him and my other grandfather and some of their friends. This was going to be a side project. Okay, so I went to him and I said, Papa, I'd like to write a book about you and your friend from World War II. He says, well, Jason, we don't talk about that. This was in 2000, the year 2000, almost 20 years ago. He says, I don't know anybody who was in the war. That's not a subject that we sit around and talk about. I said, but Papa, you go to church 7 days a week. You know everybody in town. You're in all the civic clubs. You know everybody. You've got to know some people who were in the war. He says, I don't know about that. Let me think about it. So I went to the little library and I found a book called The Honor Roll of Iberia Parish World War II Veterans. It was alphabetized, okay? There were about 1,500 men and women in this little book and little stories about it. So I read through it and I went and I brought it to him. I said, Papa, read this. tell me if you can find some friends in there, and if you do, let me know, and we'll go talk to them, and we'll interview them. That was the plan. So I'll come back a week later. I live in Houston, Texas, by the way, so it's about a 3-4 hour drive. And I show up, and he says, he's got this glow about him. He says, Jason, I read through the book. I'm so excited. I found 50 of my best friends in this book. 50 who I know very well, and I've already called them, and they're ready for us to go talk to them and interview them. I said, 50? Wow, that's a lot. I said, okay. He says, but I got some bad news. I said, what's the bad news? He says, I only got to the B's. He was an honor roll, and it was alphabetized, right? The Boudreaux. I mean, how many Boudreaux are down there, right? And Bros and Broussards. Hundreds. So that's how the project started 20 years ago. And he and I toured around Iberia Parish, and then Terrebonne Parish, and then Lafayette Parish, and then St. Martin Parish. And we did this for 5 years, he and I, and we interviewed over 150 men and women who served in World War II, and we wrote a 3-volume book series, or I did. Let me see if I can find this real quick. And there they are. So I wrote 3 books on this topic. And anyway, that was a long time ago, so I'm going to be talking about some of the veterans in here. And just to give you a little bit of background on my family, it's part of the reason why I decided to come all the way up here from Houston, Texas, is to come and walk amongst the footsteps of my ancestors as well. Let's see, my grandfather, Hewitt Theriot, there he is on the right, he and I. His father was Desiree Theriot, and they were all born and raised in Lower Terrebonne Parish, okay? In a little community called Boudreaux Canal, which is south of Houma, even further south of Chauvin, all right, on Bayou Little Caillou. And there's Desiree. I never met him. He died many years ago. But Desiree was 5 generations removed from our Acadian ancestor, Joseph Theriot, who made the trek from Acadie to Louisiana in 1765 in November. So they were on the 3rd boat. And there's Desiree managed a shrimp factory on the bayou for 50 years. And so the family was very closely connected to the shrimping industry in Lower Terrebonne Parish. And Desiree, let's see. Okay, so Desiree was known, as far as the family lore goes, to have brought the blessing of the fleet, which was a tradition that was started back in the 1920s and 30s, and is still held today in the bayous of South Louisiana. And as you can see, here are all the boats, all the shrimp boats lined up in Boudreaux Canal, and all the people on a knee, praying. And there's a father, he's saying some prayers in order to bless the shrimping fleet for the coming fleet. And I'm pretty sure somewhere in there is a 12-year-old Hewitt Theriot, my grandfather. Okay, so, I gave it away. Shoot. Did y'all see that? That was too fast. Desiree's grandfather was Michel Elway Theriot. He had a plantation on Bayou de Large, which is just to the west of this. There's a Catholic church there named the St. Michel Elway Catholic Church. And his widow donated part of the land to create this Catholic church. And I was going to ask if anyone knew the name of the town where they were from. I kind of gave it away. It's Theriot. There's a little town called Theriot, and there's my kids down there. There's 2 little Theriot kids. So there is a little town. There's a little church. It's where all of our people were buried. Look on the right-hand side. There's my granddaughter, and then there is her great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Michel Elway Theriot, buried right there. So this was the little community that we were all from. Michel Elway's grandfather was Joseph Theriot, born and raised in Beaubasson in a little place called Olac. Anybody ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Olac. It's 45 minutes that way.
Yeah.
My wife and I are going there tomorrow. Would you mind coming with us? We need a translator. We're going to go knocking on people's doors and see if we can find where they live.
Reside in Beaubassin.
Wonderful. We'll talk after, okay? So that's where they lived in 1755. Joseph Theriot, and he married the neighbor's daughter, a bourgeois, Pierre Bourgeois' daughter. There were 10, and every family had 10 kids. So he married her, and 10 years later, with a 2-year-old child, they made their way from Halifax to San Domingo into New Orleans and then settled in St. James Parish. So that's sort of brief history on all that. And to be honest, folks, I didn't know any of this history until I worked on this project. So this project was sort of, for me, a way to learn about my Acadian past. And even for my grandfather, he had no idea. This was something that was not taught in a lot of the schools in Louisiana. My grandfather was very proud to be a Cajun, but he had no idea that we even came on a boat. And so in the last 5 to 10 years, I've been able, through the internet and through meeting people from up here and scholars from up here and other territories, learn about the history of our individual family. And I'm sure that there's so many stories. Every family has kind of the same story, right? And so I'm very happy to be here, and hopefully I get to meet some cousins, right? All right, so let's move on. All right, go past that. So he and I started moving around the neighborhoods and interviewing people and getting their World War II stories and recording them, and then I wrote a book series on it. And there's just some newspaper clippings from back in the day, 2002, 3, 4, 5. And I wrote a master's thesis. I decided to go to graduate school because of this project. And I wrote a master's thesis that was sort of attached to this, but with a different spin on it. The whole book series was to understand the role that the Cajuns played in the war. But with the master's thesis, I was more interested in how the war affected them. And more importantly, how their wartime experience influenced their understanding of their identity. And lo and behold, I found 2 collections of papers, letters. One was a set of letters to the former president of USL, or UL in Lafayette. And these students and former students and alumni were writing letters to the president on their experiences in the war and what they were seeing. And many of these folks were from the Cajun country, with names like Broussard and Theriot and Como and Hebert. And they were writing about their unique experiences. And they were also talking about how they were able to use their French language and how they were starting to see the whole world differently and how their unique upbringing and their unique language experience was a benefit to them. And they're writing these letters. The other set of letters that I found was from a historian in Bridge, Louisiana. He had found letters that were written in a church bulletin. Same situation. These veterans, 20 years old, were overseas, writing letters back to be put in the church bulletin every month for the people in the community to read. And they were talking about how they appreciate being raised in Cajun country and the things that they learned, and thankful that their parents taught them French because they're using French as translators or as interpreters and so forth. Some of these letters were even written in French, believe it or not. And you folks have probably heard the story of this generation of Cajun people back in the teens and 20s. Many of them were punished for speaking French. My grandfather Hewitt, was forced to kneel down on crushed pecan shells and put his nose up against the wall because he couldn't ask to go to the bathroom in English. So they grew up with this stigma. And here they are, grown men and women in their 20s and early 20s, seeing the world and seeing how their French language is a benefit to them and to others and to the military. Okay. This is one of the first events that I had at Acadien Memorial with some of the World War II veterans, and Miss Brenda Como-Tron, she's probably taking the picture. This is at the Acadien Memorial in St. Martinville, Louisiana. All right. So the largest group of these French-speaking Cajuns were in this unit right here. Keeping me on time there?
It's 3:23.
Thank you. The 2nd Battalion of the Louisiana National Guard was made up of these companies from the Bayou country, from the Bayou Teche Valley, and most of them spoke French. In fact, the Bridge Company, few of them could speak English. These are 17, 18, 19-year-old men in 1940, 41, and 42. And they were some of the most highly trained troops before we went to Pearl Harbor. They had 2 years of intense training, combat training. We'll get to why that's interesting. Here's just some slides of them in training. I actually interviewed a fellow who carried around a 35mm camera and took all these pictures, believe it or not. A handful of them was selected and put into the officer corps, where they became officers and they served in other units. And John Meillier, for example, Silver Starred France. Ed Broussard, Silver Starred France for heroism in the line of duty at the Battle of the Bulge. But for the most part, these little units, these National Guard units, stay together. There they are. Young men being foolish for the camera. Here's a guy named Tipap Como and Etienne LeBlanc. Looks like they're playing cards or rolling dice in the back of the camp there. And here's what one of the guys had to say. He said, at Camp Blanding, this is in Florida, when we played cards, we could sometimes speak French to each other. We would like to catch 2 or 3 of them that didn't speak French so we could take their money. And I had the fortunate opportunity to interview about a dozen of these guys before they passed. And this is just some of the excerpts from their interviews. We were sent to North Africa, said Jacques Martin, because most of us spoke French. Very true. For a time, North Africa was just like Lafayette, says this fellow, Dupree. We had the old National Guard composed of Cajuns from Lafayette, Carencro, Brobridge, New Iberia, and all the Teche country. We barbecued a pig and we had beaucoup beer. So these are all in letters that they're writing or interviews that they're doing with me. And in 1942, for the invasion of North Africa, the first big Allied operation of World War II, these guys crossed from England into North Africa. Again, remember I mentioned they were highly trained, some of the most highly trained. They never saw combat. We were ordered not to speak French. This is from Joseph Fauchel, who's talking about in training when the American camp leader said, hey, y'all got to cut that French out. All right? There's all Americans here. Y'all got to speak English. So we were ordered not to speak French in training camp. But when we got to North Africa, the first thing they wanted to do was to translate for them. I was fortunate because my French kept me from the front lines, said this fellow. Warren Hebert, we were strong. I don't understand why we didn't see any combat. We were better trained than the regular army. Some of the guys said it's because we spoke French. This is from Wilfred Rockeye. He says, we had a lot of training and discipline. We could do things that others couldn't do. The local French Cajun people down here are very fine people, and they'll fight for their country. We left Lafayette with 108 men in that unit and came home with all 108. Right? So in 2004, we had a reunion at the Acadian Memorial. There's Brenda right here. Brenda, you made a cameo appearance. And there's, I don't know, what's that, 10 or 12 of them. And I can remember they all sat around in a semicircle, and their families were behind them. And either Brenda mentioned it or I mentioned it. I can't recall, it was so long ago. And we said, you know, guys, y'all went into French North Africa, y'all went into Italy. But for most of the time they were there, they were behind the lines. They were serving as interpreters or escort units or as a military police because of their French language. And in fact, the official record for this unit, I found this in the book. This is what it says. Quote, the U.S. Army reassigned the 4 guard companies of 2nd Battalion, consisting of a few hundred Cajun soldiers and a handful of fresh recruits, to perform escort duties in Oran, Algiers, quote, due to their French linguistic abilities. So here you go. Their French paid off. It kept them from the front lines. And that's what we were talking about at this meeting. And I think it was for the first time that many of them kind of realized that they were all able to make it home, and they were all, you know, raise a family and live a long life and be able to come and share these stories with us. So that's the first group of guys. Here's one of the fellows that wrote a letter home in French. Okay, believe this or not. I'm going to leave this up here for just a bit, but what caught me is so interesting is at the bottom, translated, it says a lot of us are in these countries or in occupations in which the French is required. Personally, I have many occasions to put my French to use. Did I translate that correctly? Close enough, huh? This is from Whitney LeBlanc from Brobridge, Louisiana. There's two more, and this is Emery Toops. He says, they talk the same French we did. They couldn't believe that I was an American talking about being in North Africa. Sam Delco, same thing. I was lucky that I was born and raised in this part of the country and taught a little bit of French by my parents. There was another guy, his name was Bernice Lejeune from Church Point, Louisiana. And he had a similar experience. He volunteered for the Army, and on his volunteer interview card, he said that he spoke 2 languages. And the officer that was interviewing him, he says, well, what's your other language? He says, Cajun French. And the guy looked at it, he says, Lejeune, South Louisiana, Cajun French. He says, no. The Army doesn't, we can't use that kind of French. Believe it or not, a year and a half, once word got out, he was actually removed from this artillery battalion and assigned to an officer in French North Africa as his personal translator. And he spent the next 2 years translating for this guy. Let's see, I got a little quote here. He says, most of the problems between the French and the Americans were with misunderstanding each other. Because I could speak French, this lieutenant used me as an interpreter, and that kept me from the front line. When the French had a problem, they would come to him, and I would interpret for him. My French came in handy, and I never left his side. With the coming invasion of the European mainland in Normandy, the ability to bridge the communication gap with the French underground, the Maquis, the French resistance, that was essential to the success of Operation Overlord, especially during the critical period just before and immediately after the D-Day landings. When these troops landed on the French mainland, beginning in June of 1944, the officers were asking for one important guy, Frenchie. Where's Frenchie? Somebody find me Frenchie, they would demand. I need to get Frenchie over here. We need to talk to these French resistance forces. We need to talk to this French farmer over here. And who was Frenchie? A little Cajun voice who grew up speaking the language. This quote is from Brigadier General Bob LeBlanc, who was one of the Frenchies. He says, throughout the war it became common knowledge, especially in France, that if you wanted someone to communicate with the Frenchy people or the Frenchy army, you had to find yourself a Frenchie from Louisiana. Frenchie could communicate with the locals. He could direct convoys. He could read maps. He could bargain for things that were hard to find, right? Like eggs, coffee, cognac. These were important things to young 20-year-old men in a foreign country. Also, the local French girls were quite fond of these French-speaking GIs, as you can imagine. In fact, some of them became war brides and moved back home to South Louisiana with these Cajun soldiers. Little was known about these veterans' unique experiences until just a few decades ago. The Cajuns' untarnished regional dialect from centuries past delighted the local French people and provided nearly perfect liaisons between the American officers and the leaders of the French underground. This was key because the French resistance, the Maquis, were so important for the success of the Normandy operation. They disrupted German armored movements. They blew up bridges and army depots and attacked columns and essentially wreaked havoc all over the German lines in Normandy. And all of this was in tight coordination with American forces and French-speaking Cajun GIs as interpreters. Film director Pat Meir put together a film years ago called Mon Cher Comrade, where he interviewed several of these Cajun interpreters. But he estimated that there was as many as 60 or so official Cajuns who served as translators. I think it's a lot more than that, because just look at that little book that I told you about from Iberia Parish, right? There were 1,500 people in it, men and women. I'd say that half of them probably spoke French growing up. That's 500-600, right? 10% of that probably served in France or in French North Africa. That's only one little parish. There's 12 of them in South Louisiana. So you're talking about a significant number of men who served in these either official or unofficial capacities as translators. Hello, sir. Welcome. Let's see, I got a few little slides here. Take a breath. There's the invasion of Normandy. Greeting the liberators. Okay, so here's some of the letters that I was telling you about earlier, right? This is from Homer Doucet. He's writing from somewhere in France to the president of Southwest Louisiana. And he says here, my knowledge of French surely has stood me in good stead since I've been in France. Wouldn't give it for anything in the world, and spent half my time interpreting for the boys. There was a guy of the the U.S. Army 7th Corps, which essentially took over the Cherbourg Peninsula, which is an important part of the Normandy operation. There were 450 men who served in the headquarters unit for that massive army. Only one spoke French, Ned Arsenault from Lafayette, Louisiana. Sweet old man. I remember sitting there talking to him. He was very much involved in Codafield in the early days. Let's see, keep on. Here's a few more letters for y'all. This is just a representative sample here. There were dozens, if not hundreds of these. Okay, here's another guy. This is Lee Arsenault. I enjoyed, including my French language. Here's Thomas Clement. He says, this is one place that my French knowledge of Cajun French, one place that my knowledge of Cajun French really comes in handy. This is from Rita Durand. She was in the WWII. She writes, my knowledge of French is helping me considerably. One more here. T.D. Dwarwon. D-O-I-R-O-N. My French is more correct than most of the dialects I've heard in Normandy and Brittany, he says. All right? So it's no wonder that when they returned home from the war, they soaked themselves into their Cajun heritage. Right? At least these folks did. All right, this is the last group we're going to talk about. This is one of my favorite stories. In the early 1940s, as the United States was building up for the war, they had no spy agency. There was no CIA at the time. And they created an agency called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. The OSS was the predecessor to today's CIA. And for the all-important invasion of France and the retaking of the continental Europe, the OSS was active in recruiting spies or young men who had to volunteer. You had to volunteer for this operation, for this unit. You had to agree to jump out of an airplane. But most importantly, you had to speak the language in the place that you were going to be operating. So for Normandy, right, it was French. And where better to find young, rugged, skilled French speakers than in South Louisiana. And so OSS recruited about a dozen of these guys. And I'm going to tell y'all some stories about 2 or 3 of them who I met and spent a lot of time with, okay? All right. They were trained in the dark arts of espionage. They worked undercover and behind enemy lines. They helped defeat the German army in France, and they were Cajun. So here's just a few little slides of them in training. Amphibious training, scaling towers. They were actually trained in the particular mannerisms of the French people, right? How a Frenchman smokes a cigarette down to the very end. Okay, if you're going to be acting as if you're a Frenchman, your fingers had to be brown. Okay, you couldn't smoke just a little bit of cigarette and throw it. So all these different mannerisms, they were taking classes and they were learning about all of these little etiquettes of the French people, right? And about the particular language, the patois of the language that they were going to be operating in, especially Normandy and in Brittany. And then most importantly was the radio. So every day, twice a day, they sent out a coded radio message back to London. That message was taken and then the information was sent back to them later on. And they were operating behind enemy lines with a French counterpart and translating and giving instructions to the French leader on which German tank column to blow up. And where were the Germans headed today? And what bridge did we need to assault? These kinds of things. And the French were sending information back saying, we need more guns. We need to get paid. These kinds of things, right? So drop the parachutes full of explosives, weapons, and money, and these kinds of things. So that's how the French Cajuns utilized the communication system for operating with the OSS. Here's just a map of where the French underground operated, the main sections of the French Maquis. You can see up there in the top, Brittany, there was a huge contingency of French Maquis up there, and then down in southern France, in the Pyrenees. Those are the 2 areas we'll be talking about here for just a minute. So one of the groups that was a part of OSS were these groups called operational groups, and they were 15-man hit teams. They were all trained together. They were all trained in hand-to-hand combat and in explosives and they were trained parachutists, and they all spoke French. There was one officer and 14 enlisted men. And this particular group right here, PEG, there were two guys from South Louisiana, Roy Armentar, who I interviewed and got to know very well, and he was from Abbeville, and Claude Galley, who was from a little town called Montague, near the town of Theriot in Lower Terrebonne Parish. They trained together, they parachuted in southern France. Both were wounded, okay, and they conducted operations with their French resistance allies, the team that they met on the ground, for 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. And here's a map of where they jumped into. You can see down here. All these are spots where the OSS groups of French-speaking soldiers parachuted and coordinated activities with French resistance all around June, July, and August of 1944 for the invasion of France and the retaking of the continent. So they all played a critical role. This is a quote from Roy Armentar. He said, "We were trained to cut railroads for trains, blow up bridges, and attack enemy columns. All of us had basically the same training, the same skills, the same weapons, the same specialty, and we all spoke French." And there's two of them who were from South Louisiana. There was another group of guys. They were called the Jedburghs. And, let me tell you about this. So Roy Armentar, right, the magic of the worldwide internet. Roy Armentar, at age 85, figured out how to get online and started doing research on all this. And he actually made contact with the French Maquis veterans group who met him on the ground when they parachuted into southern France. And they became friends, and they wrote letters, and they sent him this picture, and the guys with the numbers on their shirt were the guys who were actually in the field when they landed. And I remember I told you that both Galley and Armentar were wounded. Armentar wounded on the jump. Galley wounded in an ambush a couple of days later. And these Frenchmen took them into the woods, and they brought them to their houses, and they had them treated, and they moved them around because the Germans were looking for these American spies, right? We know what happened if they would have got caught. But anyway, how neat is that they were able to reconnect all these many years later? There was another group called Jedburghs. These guys were trained officers. There were three-man teams. There was an American, a British radio operator, and a Frenchman. And they were trained to parachute on the night of D-Day in and around Normandy area. And just before the invasion, Eisenhower broke some of these units up and created these detachments. These would be French speaker officers of OSS who would go in advance of the armored units. Here was one, Sam Broussard from, I think Sam was from either from New Iberia or St. Martinville. He died in the 1990s. I never got to interview him, but his family did a video, and here's what Sam said. He said, "My job was to interrogate the French people behind enemy lines and to find out about the German forces. We supplied the underground with weapons and explosives. I organized a band of Maquis and attached them to various American infantry units as our forces moved into occupied areas where the French were experts at infiltration." Here's another guy, Ray Trumps from Sicilia. He was a Jedburgh that parachuted in. I'm going to go through these just a little quickly, just so you can get a glance. But this is a map of Brittany, and these are all the Special Forces small team units that parachuted in or were deployed into Brittany to operate with the French resistance. Bob LeBlanc was another one. He went at the head of Patton's Third Army. And these are just some slides and some maps where the OSS agents were operating. One more. So many years later, I was able to get some of these guys together for a reunion. And this is them right here. Here's the Cajuns of OSS. There's Claude Galley, Bob LeBlanc, and Roy Armentar on the side. This is what Bob LeBlanc had to say. He said, "You know, we've always been considered peasants in the American Army. We were the illiterate little boys who were raised in the swamp, but we proved them wrong." That's what he said. And Bob LeBlanc was a brigadier general retired. He ran the National Guard for 25 years. There he is for the 250th anniversary of the Acadian deportation. He and I gave a speech together. General LeBlanc became a celebrity of sorts, right? And for good reason. Newspapers wanted to write stories about him. Documentary filmmakers wanted to do documentaries about him. And for many years there was stories and articles. Here he is, last year, receiving the Congressional Gold Medal for operations of the OSS. And I am happy to tell you folks that as of 3 weeks ago, General Bob LeBlanc is doing well, living in Abbeville, Louisiana. I took my 2 kids to meet him. My daughter actually interviewed General LeBlanc. I have it on film, but we'll have to show it at another time. But it was a really neat experience to have my 11-year-old daughter interview one of the great World War II heroes from Louisiana. And it was quite a treat for all of us. So he's 98, still doing good. Oddly enough, living with his sister-in-law, 103 years old. Okay? You put them two together, 98 and 103, that's 200 years. That's a long time. Let's see. If you want to see some of those videos, I have a website here, and I've got a bunch of videos that I've been putting together over the last couple of years. The one with my daughter is on there, jasontheriot.com, and so you can go and see some of that stuff. I'm going to wrap it up here. Okay, so something special happened to these Cajuns serving in French territories. Chris Segura wrote this in Warren Perrin's book, Acadian Redemption. He says, in France, the Cajuns found newborn value in something that they had that was very old, something that was basic for survival of their culture. It was their language. They still spoke French, he goes on. Ironically, the language faced with obliteration at home suddenly made them more vital to the war efforts. And they discovered that their colloquial idiom wasn't as substandard as they had been led to believe. This was the genesis of the Acadian Renaissance, this guy writes. It all had to do with long-lost pride. The Cajun culture survived this tumultuous period even without the language being passed on to the next generation. The men and women who stormed the beaches and welded the hulls together, they emerged from the war as loyal Americans, but also very proud of their Cajun heritage. And they continued with their cultural identity. And they immersed themselves in their culture with food and the cuisine and the Cajun music that's so important to even our cousins from other places, in Texas and certainly up here, as we saw this whole week here. And we're about to see right here with some Cajun food here. And so the Second World War finally legitimized the Cajuns in their eyes and in their skeptics. Thank you, folks.